Hi folks, we're up to the fourth day of Holy Week. This is Holy Thursday. We're going to do Thursday and Friday's devotional here from the sanctuary. I thought it'd be more appropriate. As you can see, they've already got the church set up for Easter morning, so that's why we've got the white everywhere, and you can see there's some lilies and so on, so it'll make you feel a little more like you're in church while we're doing this. Now, we've been going day by day through Jesus' life and what he did from essentially before Palm Sunday right through this week. And now we hit one of what we would call one of the major days of Holy Week, Holy Thursday, or the evening of the Last Supper. One thing that you need to understand is that the events of this day basically continue to flow right in through the day Friday. There's no break. Now, I will do that for this devotional. We'll have a separate one. I'm going to record them both now, of course, but there will be a separate one for tomorrow for Good Friday where we cover those events. But the events that happened on Thursday didn't just stop and then get picked up later on Friday. Everything continued to flow from the time the disciples and Jesus met together in the upper room for the Last Supper all the way through till we get to Jesus' body being taken down from the cross. There is something happening. And so we want to keep that in mind as we're understanding what he went through, understanding what the timeline was, and also how God's plan was unfolding with event after event after event after event as things came to a head when he went to the cross. But let's pick it up first for the preparation. On Holy Thursday, Jesus and the disciples spend much of the day preparing to celebrate the Passover feast. Now remember, we left on Wednesday. He was at the house of Simon the leper. We said either he lodged there or he stayed somewhere else on the Mount of Olives, or even possibly left Simon the leper's house and went to Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house in Bethany on the far side of the Mount of Olives. So he's not in Jerusalem as Thursday begins, but he's going to celebrate the Passover meal in Jerusalem. He wants to be closer to where things are going to happen. Arrangements are being made, and they're going to leave wherever he was outside of the city, and as the day wears on, they come in to begin the celebration. Now, Jesus sent Peter and John on ahead to prepare the location and the meal in the upper room. Again, as we said, it was a place in Jerusalem. It was somebody's private residence. One of the things that we know is that in the cities, particularly people who had larger homes, maybe they were wealthier people, had a second story which usually included a large open room for banquets, parties, get-togethers, events like that. So this wasn't unusual, but it's called the upper room because it's on the second story, not because it's like up on top of the hill or anything like that, most likely speaking. So there is a place that Jesus has coordinated or is coordinating with the disciples to have that upper room. Somebody, again, who must have known him, who was friendly to him, maybe another part-time disciple, we don't know. As far as we know, it's none of the 12's home or families, but it was a case where he knew where he was going, and the people that were there were glad to have them. They weren't just strangers showing up at the door, at the door saying, okay, we want to meet here. So we see all three of the first Gospels mentioning them being going into the city and scouting out the location and getting the Passover meal all set up. That's Matthew 26, 17 to 19, Mark 14, 12 to 16, and Luke 22, 7 through 13. So we're fairly certain. And of course, John covers the evening as well, but he has different material than the first three Gospels do, and that's pretty common. You know, the three Gospels agree with each other much more, and John fills in a lot of places where they omit things that happen. So on Holy Thursday evening, Jesus and the disciples gathered to celebrate the Passover meal. This was a huge tradition with the Jews. It's something the Jews certainly still do to this day, commemorating the meal that the Israelites celebrated the night before they were delivered from bondage in Egypt. It's the night where the Passover lamb was slaughtered and then eaten, and its blood was smeared over the lintels and the doorposts of their houses, so that when the angel of death passed over, the destroyer passed over, they were spared, but all the other firstborn in Egypt were killed that night. That was the last of the 10 plagues, and the next day Pharaoh finally relented, and it was their day of liberation. They were ready to leave, and Moses had warned them, be ready to leave in the morning. So this memorial that they continued to remember and celebrate was the beginnings of their freedom as a nation after they had been in bondage for a long time in Egypt. So this was very important to the Jews, and it was something that didn't just happen in the temple. Individual families did it as well, just as the Jews still do today. And this was Jesus with his family celebrating the Passover. Now, as they met, a number of events happened, a number of important things happened. This was Jesus' last time that he was going to be able to spend with his disciples before the arrest and the trials and the crucifixion. So this was his last opportunity to fellowship with them, to teach them, to prepare them for what was going to come. And it was during the meal, when they're eating the Passover meal, that Judas is revealed as the betrayer, and he leaves the group during the meal. Jesus tells him, what you do, do quickly, and he left. He went out into the night on his way to inform the chief priests where Jesus was going to be, where he could betray him. I think by then Jesus would have let the disciples know that after we're finished here, guys, we're going to go over to the Garden of Gethsemane and pray. Garden of Gethsemane was a place that Jesus would frequent from time to time as a place of prayer, so it wasn't unusual in their minds at that point as to what was going to happen there. But Judas leaves and he goes out, and that's during the evening meal. Now, one of the things that John brings out from John 13, 1 through 20, that the other three don't include, the other three Gospels don't include, is the fact that Jesus washed the disciples' feet. It was a ceremonial washing. It was kind of preparation for the main feast, for the big celebration. And typically, if you were invited to someone's house for a banquet, a special dinner, and they were well off, they would have their servants do that you would have your feet washed and feel refreshed that way from walking on the dusty streets and roads, or even muddy sometimes in Israel. It was a way for the host to honor his guests. But the host didn't do it. It was the servant who did it. It was the slave, household slave, that did it. It wasn't the master. But Jesus, wanting to teach his disciples that we all need to be servants of each other, and that he showed his humility as the ultimate servant, then he washed all of the disciples' feet for them. And they were shocked that, because he was the master, the teacher, the rabbi, the leader, and yet he showed that humility for his own people. It was also a way that he could honor them and love them one last time. Now, as the Passover feast progressed, and it was ritualistic, they had certain things that they did. I won't take the time to go into all of that. At some point, maybe we'll have a reenactment of a Jewish Seder as part of our Holy Week celebrations. But for right now, we won't get into all of that. But it was during that ceremony, at least near the end of it, that Jesus gave the bread and the wine new meaning. He broke the bread and gave it to them and explained that this bread symbolized his body. And then he gave them a cup of wine and said that they all should drink from it because that symbolized his shed blood which was given for them and for many for the forgiveness of sins. So he instituted the Lord's Supper at the Last Supper. I know terminology can be confusing. And he says, do this in remembrance of me. And of course, then later Paul adds on to that, saying, we do this, we commemorate this until he returns. So this was something that Jesus brought to the disciples that was new, that was something they wouldn't ever have done before at a Passover dinner. But he was preparing them for what was going to come, and he gave this ritual or sacrament or whatever title you want to give it to the disciples to continue practicing as the Christian church. And of course we have. During their conversation, he talks about being betrayed and being arrested and going to the cross. And Peter boldly brags and says, well, Lord, even if all the rest of these guys betray you, I never will. And yet Jesus makes it very clear, Peter, yes, you will. You will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And that just shocked Peter because he couldn't believe that. And yet again, he was just preparing Peter for what was to come, because obviously Peter did do that. We'll talk about that more with the Good Friday devotional. Jesus spent a considerable amount of time in final teaching of the disciples. Now, you don't get that from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They don't focus so much on Jesus' teaching as the events of the Last Supper, the ritual, and the meal. But John fills in what also went on. And John takes from John 13:31 through 16:33, he includes a huge section of teaching that Jesus gave the disciples, their final teaching. He talks about the true mark of a Christian, that we love one another. He talked about the coming of the Holy Spirit and what his ministry was going to be. He was the counselor, he was the convictor, he was the comforter, a number of roles that he would play in the future of the Christian church. He explained that to them. He also made very clear to them that he is the only way to heaven. John 14, chapter 6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And so a number of these teachings in this section are very important for our faith. Please read through them again. But all of that took place during this period, that evening with the Last Supper.Maybe not during dinner, or maybe it was interspersed. I don't know. John's goal is just to give us the information. He's not trying to be, a chronology of events. And then Jesus offers what's been called his high priestly prayer for the disciples and those who would believe after them in John 17. It's a very powerful, long prayer that Jesus prays for the disciples. He communes with God during this time, and he is getting himself and the disciples prepared for what was to come, and then what would come after all of the events of the cross and the resurrection. One of the things that theologians will describe Jesus as is he was prophet, priest, and king. He was king in that he's king of the Jews, king of kings, Lord of lords. He was the prophet in the sense that he brought God's truth to the world, but he was also priest because he is the one who makes intercession for us before God the Father, as the Jewish priests did. But instead of offering a substitute sacrifice, he offered himself in sacrifice. But he is the great high priest, and that's why this is called the high priestly prayer, because this was the main prayer that Jesus gave to benefit the disciples and all of us. So that's why it's called that. The meeting in the upper room concluded with the singing of a hymn. Matthew 26:30 and Mark 14:26 says they sang a hymn and then they went out. We don't know what it was. It was probably something from the Psalms, some kind of praise. I don't remember if there's a special psalm that's usually sung at the conclusion of the Passover Seder, but it could have been something connected to that. Or maybe he gave them something, different, a different focus, I'm not sure. But from the upper room, Jesus and the disciples head to the Garden of Gethsemane. They would have had to come out of the upper room, go out of the city, through the gates, down through the Kidron Valley, across the Kidron Brook, which is not a huge stream, especially if it's not the rainy season. And then just starting up the slopes of the Mount of Olives, just starting up, is where the Garden of Gethsemane was. It was an olive grove. And there still are ancient olive trees there to this day. Some think it may date back to the time of Christ, I don't know. But there's a church that they've built there to commemorate the location where they think Jesus met with the disciples in his time in prayer there. So they go to this Garden of Gethsemane, and it's here in the garden that Jesus agonizes in prayer 3 times. He's wrestling with what is to come. He asks, is it possible for the Father to remove the cup from him? In other words, the fate that he has in store for him, the plan he has in store for him with all of the suffering and all of the shame and humiliation and all the evil that would be dumped onto him, being the sacrifice for sin. And of course, eventually, he steels himself and relies on the power of God, and he is now resolute. He's going to the cross. Nothing is going to stop him. 3 times he wrestles with this in prayer, and then he also tries to awaken the disciples who are all asleep at this point. And says, why couldn't you stay awake and pray with me? Well, again, this is very late. It's probably approaching midnight. They've had a long day to this point. It's not to excuse them, but they don't have Jesus' force of will, of course, to keep going. And it's dark and, quiet, and they just nodded right off, I'm sure. But he challenges them about that. So finally, after this 3rd session in prayer, when Jesus is resolute that he's going to the cross, then Judas arrives in the garden. He's with a large crowd from the chief priests and the elders, from the temple guard, and a contingent of Roman soldiers, a cohort, John describes, which could mean as many as 500 soldiers. So it was not a quick sneak in the middle of the night, grab him before anybody can see him. It was in the middle of the night and they weren't in the city, but it was a large crowd that came to get him. They didn't want any trouble, and they didn't know, would Jesus be with people? Could he call people to his defense? He was also a miracle worker, so would they have to battle the supernatural? There were a number of things that played into their decision, I'm sure, to come with this many people to arrest him. But Judas is leading him because he has decided he's the one who's going to betray him. He's accepted the money, and now he is turning Jesus over to his enemies. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss, and then Peter reacts violently by cutting off the high priest's servant's ear, his name is Malchus, with a sword. Jesus had a brief conversation at the Last Supper about everybody having a sword for self-protection, probably, and so Peter has one with him, and he's trying to save Jesus. He just lashes out at the first person closest to him, probably trying to get Jesus out of there, maybe, and he ends up cutting the ear off of Malchus. Well, Jesus rebukes him for this because he says, look, Peter, if you're going to be a violent person in how you live, you're going to die a violent death. This is not who I'm calling you to be. This is not what my church is going to be. And then in Jesus' last miracle before the cross, he restores Malchus's ear. He heals it. And he's back to normal again. So I'm going to stop the devotional at this point because now we're getting into the events of Good Friday and how they will play out. And it is probably by now after midnight, and so it is Friday. Now remember, for the Jews, after 6 p.m. is the next day. We don't think of it that way. So if you're really looking at it from a Jewish perspective, probably the Last Supper all the way through the crucifixion technically happened on their Good Friday, or their Friday, or their Passover celebration day. But I'm breaking it down the way we would do the day, with the time and midnight being the start of the next day. So that's as far as I want to go with this devotional for Holy Thursday. But please take some time, read through some of the events that happen on Holy Thursday. They were very important. As I said, the first 3 Gospels focus on the Last Supper. John focuses on filling in things that aren't included there, like the foot washing and the reasoning behind that, and the whole section of teaching for them, the final teachings that Jesus would give to the disciples, and then ultimately the high priestly prayer where he prayed for them and prayed for us. It's very important to understand the plan that he had and the foresight he had to look not just to his immediate future, but for the entire future of humanity and how this was all playing into it. And that's part of who we are and where we are today. So I hope that you have a great, Holy Thursday evening. And we will be celebrating Holy Communion in church on Sunday, since we don't do a evening Holy Thursday service in our church. But we will include that element in it for Easter Sunday. So if you can join us, I'll give you a quick invitation here to please come. And if not, well, then we will have it for you online, Lord willing. So thank you again for listening, and I pray that you have a great evening.